You're walking through an old coastal New England town, maybe Nantucket, maybe Cape Cod, and you look up. Perched on top of one of these grand old houses, right at the peak of the roof, is a small railed platform. No walls, no roof over it. Just a narrow walkway, sitting up there like someone built a balcony and forgot to attach it to anything useful. Ask a local what it's called, and they'll almost always tell you the same story. It's a widow's walk, and they'll tell it with a kind of hush in their voice, like they're letting you in on something sad. This is where the wives of sea captains used to stand, they'll say, scanning the horizon for a ship that was already weeks overdue, praying for a sail that, for some of them, never came. Some of these women, the story goes, were a groove into the wood, pacing back and forth for years, waiting for husbands the ocean had already taken. It's a beautiful story. It's the kind of story that makes you stop on the sidewalk and stare up at that little platform a second longer than you meant to. Here's the part that should genuinely stop you, though. Multiple historians who've actually dug into the record say that romantic image is almost entirely made up. Not embellished, not exaggerated. Largely invented, decades after these platforms were even being built. So if grieving widows weren't up there staring out to sea, what was that platform actually for? And why did an entire region of America build thousands of them anyway? Rewind to the early 1800s, along the coast of Massachusetts, in booming whaling ports like Nantucket and New Bedford. Grand new houses were going up everywhere, funded by one of the most profitable industries in the country. And a lot of these houses had a small platform built into the roof line, usually wrapped right around the chimney. Nobody called it a widow's walk. Nobody living at the time used that phrase at all. Architects and homeowners referred to it as a roof walk, sometimes a captain's walk, sometimes, even more plainly, a scuttle, the same word used for the small drainage opening on a ship's deck. In one 1917 architectural study of early Nantucket homes, the structure is described simply as a captain's walk, used for watching incoming ships, and for a much less poetic reason you'll hear in a second. None of these original names had anything to do with grief. That detail alone should tell you something. If this platform had really been built for widows to mourn on, you'd expect the people who built it, and the people who first stood on it, to have called it exactly that. They didn't. These platforms weren't rare either. They showed up on hundreds of homes across coastal Massachusetts, Maine, and Connecticut, especially in towns tied directly to the whaling and shipping trade. Nantucket alone still has dozens of surviving examples today, some dating back to the early 1800s, still perched right where they were originally built, chimney and all. This is The Dark Origin, and if you like digging into the real story behind the details you walk past every day, hit subscribe now. Tell us in the comments what everyday object or architectural detail you want us to dig into next, and we'll go find the real answer. Here's the boring, practical truth, and it turns out to be far more interesting than the myth once you understand it. In the early 1800s, almost every home was heated with wood-burning fireplaces, sometimes several of them, one in nearly every room. Every one of those fireplaces fed into the same network of chimneys, and every one of those chimneys over time built up a coating of grease and creosote from years of burning wood. That buildup was, quite literally, fuel waiting for a spark. Chimney fires were a genuinely common danger, especially during the coldest months, when fires burned longest and hottest. And when a chimney fire broke out, someone needed to get up onto the roof fast, with something to smother the flames, sand or water, poured directly down the flue. That's exactly where the roof walk earned its keep. Because it was usually built directly around the chimney stack, it gave homeowners a stable, safe platform, right at the exact point where the danger was. Without it, putting out a chimney fire meant hauling a heavy bucket up a tall ladder on a steep, often ice-covered roof in the middle of a New England winter. Think about that for a second. A wet, frozen roof, a 2-story drop, and a fire spreading through your house, and your only option is a rickety ladder. The roofwalk turned a genuinely life-threatening climb into a short, safe walk from an internal staircase straight up through a hatch. It gets even more practical from there. Because these platforms sat right at the roofline, they also helped smoke and heat vent out of the house more efficiently during the warmer months, an early, low-tech form of home ventilation, decades before anyone had a name for that either. There's a detail here that makes the whole design click into place. Winters in coastal New England weren't gentle. Snow and ice regularly coated rooftops for weeks at a time, and a steep, frozen roof is one of the most dangerous surfaces a person can try to stand on, let alone climb a ladder onto while carrying a heavy bucket. The roof walk solved that entire problem in one stroke. An internal staircase led straight up to a hatch, and from there, a flat, railed, relatively stable surface right where the chimney needed attention most. It wasn't a luxury feature. In a genuine emergency, it was the difference between putting out a fire in minutes and watching an entire home burn because nobody could safely reach the roof in time. So here's the real question. If this thing was built for fighting chimney fires, how on earth did it end up known worldwide as a place where grieving widows waited for ships that never came home? The timeline is the giveaway. Historians tracing the phrase "widow's walk" through newspapers, novels, and local records find that the romanticized name doesn't really take hold until the late 1800s and early 1900s, well after most of these platforms had already been standing for decades. By that point, the golden age of whaling was fading fast, steam power was replacing sail, and New England's coastal towns were shifting from working ports into something closer to nostalgic tourist destinations. And nostalgia needs a good story. This platform helped us dump sand down the chimney during a fire is true and completely forgettable. This is where a sea captain's wife paced for years, waiting for a ship that was already lost, is the kind of detail a tour guide can build an entire afternoon around. One version sells a practical home feature, the other sells an entire town's romantic, tragic identity. It's worth being fair to the legend here, too. Sea captains really did leave for voyages that sometimes lasted years. Ships really were lost at sea, sometimes without a trace, and families really did wait, sometimes for good news that never arrived. That underlying grief was completely real. It just probably didn't happen specifically on this particular rooftop platform, at least not as some kind of common, everyday ritual. The genuine sorrow of a whaling town got attached, after the fact, to the most visually striking, most photogenic architectural detail available, and the two stories fused together so completely that most people today have never heard the platform's original, much duller name at all. There's also a slightly darker footnote some historians point to. A handful of accounts describe firefighters, not widows, losing their footing and falling from these platforms while battling chimney fires in dangerous conditions, and some researchers have speculated that this, rather than any grieving wife, may be part of where the name's morbid undertone genuinely originated. If that's true, the platform's widow connection may have started as a reference to fire deaths among rescuers before folklore quietly rewrote it into a far gentler, more romantic story about waiting wives instead. By the mid to late 1800s, something else was happening architecturally that helped cement the whole image in place. Italianate architecture, a style built around ornate cupolas and rooftop viewing platforms, was becoming enormously fashionable across New England. Builders started adding these roof walks not just for fire access anymore, but purely for the view. Elaborate railings, decorative ironwork, platforms clearly meant to be seen and admired rather than climbed onto in an emergency. As indoor plumbing, safer heating systems, and eventually electricity reduced the constant threat of chimney fires, the platform's original practical job quietly disappeared. What was left behind was purely aesthetic. A striking, slightly mysterious architectural flourish sitting on top of some of the most beautiful old homes on the eastern seaboard. And a purely decorative feature, stripped of its boring original purpose, was exactly the kind of blank canvas a good ghost story needed. Today, homeowners lucky enough to have one mostly use their widow's walk for exactly what the romantic version of the story always imagined: quiet evenings watching the sunset, a private little perch above the trees, occasionally repurposed into a small rooftop deck. The fire bucket is long gone. The name that stuck around, though, tells you everything about which version of a story people actually want to keep telling. There's a genuinely strange irony sitting at the center of all this. A feature invented purely for fire safety somehow lost its practical name entirely and kept only its fictional one. Ask most homeowners today why their historic house has a widow's walk, and they'll almost certainly tell you the sad version: the sailors' wives, the endless waiting, the lonely vigil. Very few know they're living underneath what used to be, quite literally, a rooftop fire station. So picture that same walk through town again. You look up, and there it is, that same small railed platform sitting at the peak of an old New England roof. Except now you know both versions. You know it almost certainly wasn't built for grieving wives to watch an empty horizon. You know its real first job was something far less poetic: a safe place to stand while dumping sand down a burning chimney, at a time when a house fire could take everything a family owned in a single winter night. And you also know exactly why the sadder story won anyway, because a name like roofwalk describes a chore, and a name like widow's walk describes a life. Maybe that's worth remembering the next time you hear a story about an old house that sounds just a little too perfectly tragic to be entirely true. Somewhere behind it, there's probably a person with a bucket of sand, doing something remarkably unromantic to keep their family safe, and somewhere right alongside that person, a much better story, waiting patiently for its turn to be told instead.